Every day, thousands of people walk down a stone plaza in Jerusalem, put their hands flat against a wall, and press folded slips of paper into the cracks. Many have flown across the world to touch it, and most believe they are touching the last surviving piece of the temple. They are not. That is a retaining wall. Its job is to hold up the artificial platform the building once stood on. It was never part of the building. Herod's engineers laid it around 19 BC to stop a hilltop spreading, and the 7 lowest courses you can see above ground are the ones they cut. Of the sanctuary itself, the gold-plated doors, the veil, the room, almost nobody entered. Nothing survives at all. Not one stone left on another, which is precisely what somebody standing in its courtyard said would happen. So, the temple. Not one building, but a sequence of them on the same rock, each grander than the last, and every one of them came down. Solomon's burned. Its replacement was looted, desecrated, and finally swallowed whole by a bigger one. Herod's was demolished within a lifetime of being finished. So the real question is not what the temple looked like, though we will go all the way inside it. The question is, why a building that was supposedly God's own address on earth kept ending up as rubble and a national trauma? Here is the promise. The answer is not buried in a later prophecy. It is said out loud at the dedication, on the best day the building ever had, by the man who built it. We will get there in about 6 minutes. But the story starts with a king who was told no. David has won. The wars are over. The borders are quiet, and the Ark of the Covenant is sitting in a tent in the middle of his new capital. He looks at his cedar palace, then at the tent, and decides the arrangement is embarrassing. The prophet Nathan tells him to go ahead and build. That night, Nathan is told to go back and unsay it. And God's answer in 2 Samuel is less a refusal than a question nobody had thought to ask. Did I ever ask anyone for a house of cedar? He has been living in a tent since Egypt, and in all that time he never once complained. Then the sentence turns around. David will not build God a house. God will build David a house, a dynasty, and David's son will do the construction. That is the reason Samuel gives. Chronicles, written much later, gives a blunter one. You have shed much blood and waged great wars, so you shall not build. David repeats it to the assembly in his own words. You are a man of war, and you have shed blood. Solomon later gives a gentler third reason. His father never got a quiet decade to build in. 3 passages, 3 angles. Then David dies, having done the one thing he was allowed to do. He bought the site and stockpiled the materials. A threshing floor on a rise north of the old city, bought rather than seized. Chronicles calls the place Mount Moriah. The price is recorded twice in 2 different books, and the figures do not agree. We leave that in the footnotes. Solomon begins building in the 4th year of his reign. In a month, the text calls Ziv. And the real dimensions are the first surprise of this episode. 60 cubits long, 20 wide, 30 high. A cubit is a forearm, and nobody can pin it down closer than somewhere between 45 and 52 centimeters. Take the middle of that range, and the house of God is about 29 meters long and 10 wide. Smaller than many village parish churches. It was never meant to hold a congregation. Nobody worshipped inside it. The crowd stayed in the courtyard. The building was the address, not the auditorium, and it went up in silence. Stone was finished at the quarry, so no hammer, no axe, no iron tool of any kind was heard at the site. Cedar came from Lebanon by arrangement with Hiram of Tyre. Inside, the walls were carved all over with cherubim, palm trees and open flowers, then covered in gold. Even the floor was overlaid with gold in both rooms. The work took 7 years. The palace Solomon built for himself afterwards took nearly twice as long. Then came the day the finished building was handed over in front of the entire nation. And everything this video is about happens inside 10 minutes of that ceremony. The ark is carried in and set down under the wings in the inner room. The priests come out, and a cloud fills the house. It is so thick the priests cannot stand up to do their jobs. Chronicles adds fire falling out of the sky onto the altar in the courtyard. By any measure, this is the moment the project is validated. And Solomon, standing before the whole nation at the peak of his life, says this: "Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built?" Read it again. The builder, at his own dedication, tells the crowd the building is too small for its occupant. That is not modesty. It is load-bearing. He does not ask God to move in. He asks God to keep his eyes on the place and to listen from heaven when people pray towards it. The temple is not a container. It is an address, a direction to face. And that distinction is the entire argument of this episode. Because a container cannot be lost without losing what is inside. An address can be leveled to the ground, and the one you are addressing is entirely unaffected. Then God answers, and the answer arrives with a condition welded onto it. If you or your children turn aside and serve other gods, then here is what happens. I will cut Israel off from this land, and this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by will be astonished and will hiss. That is 1 Kings 9. The demolition notice is issued on opening day, before the gold has dulled. So when the building falls, nobody can claim surprise. Hold that thought and let us go inside, because the furniture is extraordinary and the text describes it with the flat precision of an inventory clerk. You approach the front, and the first thing you meet is a pair of bronze pillars standing free of the porch, holding up nothing at all. 18 cubits high, with a line of 12 cubits measuring the way around. Hollow, cast in bronze, the metal 4 fingers thick, roughly 8.5 meters tall, nearly 2 meters across. Not decoration, not structure, but a gateway. And they had names. The one on the south was Jachin, the one on the north was Boaz. Naming a structural column is not normal anywhere. On top of each sat a bronze capital worked with lattice, chains, and 2 rows of pomegranates, finished with lily work. Jeremiah's account even counts them. 96 pomegranates showing on the sides, out of 100 set around the whole network of one capital. The pillar height is a place the text argues with itself. Kings and Jeremiah both say 18 cubits for one pillar. Chronicles gives 35, close to the 2 combined. Past the pillars, out in the courtyard, stood the strangest object in the entire complex. The text gives it no fancy name at all. It calls it the sea. A single cast metal basin, perfectly round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, 5 cubits deep, with a line of 30 cubits measuring around the outside. Call it close to 5 meters across. Its rim was shaped like the brim of a cup, flaring outward like a lily blossom, the metal a handbreadth thick. Under the brim ran 2 rows of gourds, cast in one piece with the bowl itself. And the whole thing stood on the backs of 12 bronze oxen. 3 faced north, 3 west, 3 south, 3 east, with their hindquarters turned inward underneath it. Kings gives its capacity as 2,000 baths. Chronicles, describing the same basin, says 3,000. A bath is estimated from surviving storage jars at about 22 liters, so the sea held over 40,000. 40,000 liters of standing water, carried on 12 bronze bowls in front of the house of a god whose law was famously wary of cast animals. The text never explains any of it beyond washing. Then the doors. Olivewood, 5-sided frames carved with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers overlaid with gold. Behind them, the inner sanctuary. A perfect cube, 20 cubits long, 20 wide, 20 high, and lined from floor to ceiling with pure gold. Inside it stood 2 cherubim carved out of olive wood, each one 10 cubits tall, something close to 5 meters, standing upright on their own feet and overlaid entirely with gold. Each wing measured 5 cubits, so 10 cubits from wingtip to wingtip. One outer wing touched one wall, the other the opposite wall, their inner wings meeting in the middle. 20 cubits of wing across a room, 20 cubits wide. The figures were not placed in the room. The room was built to fit their span exactly. Under those wings sat the Ark of the Covenant. That is the entire contents of the holiest room on earth. 1 box and 2 giants standing over empty air. Outside it, 10 golden lampstands, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north. A golden altar. A golden table for the bread of the presence. Cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, fire pans, all of it pure gold, down to the sockets the doors turned in. That is the building. Now watch. Solomon dies, and the kingdom splits. In the 5th year of his son Rehoboam, Shishak of Egypt comes up against Jerusalem and walks into the treasury. He takes the treasures of the house of the Lord. He takes everything, the text says, including all the golden shields that Solomon had made. That is a little over 30 years after the ribbon was cut, and it becomes a habit. Kings of Judah empty the treasury repeatedly to buy off invaders. Hezekiah, one of the good ones, peels the gold off the temple doors and doorposts he had overlaid himself and hands it to the king of Assyria. But money is the small problem. The bigger one is what starts getting installed inside. Manasseh builds altars to the host of heaven in both courts of the house, and he sets a carved image of Asherah inside the building, a goddess pole in the house whose whole point was that this god shares his address with nobody. His grandson Josiah tears it out. Vessels made for Baal and Asherah are carried off and burned in the fields of the Kidron, their ashes taken away to Bethel. The Asherah itself is dragged from the house, burned, beaten to dust. Buildings inside the precinct are demolished. And during those repairs, the high priest finds a book. He gives it to the king's secretary, who reads it aloud to the king. The king tears his clothes. The building had run for centuries not knowing what that book said. Meanwhile, the prophets are saying something the crowds find close to blasphemous. Jeremiah stands in the temple gate and mocks the chant of the people going in. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. He calls these deceptive words and tells them to go and look at Shiloh. That was where God's name had lived before, and the answer is that nothing is standing there. Shiloh was already a ruin, and everybody knew it. His point is that a building has never once made anybody safe. Ezekiel, deported to Babylon, sees the same thing from the other end of the story. He watches the glory of God leave, out from the threshold, up on the cherubim, out of the city, and it stops on the mountain to the east. In Ezekiel's account, the building is already empty before the besieging army ever arrives. What Babylon eventually destroys is a very expensive shell. And Babylon arrives. 586 BC, the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, an officer named Nebuzaradan, captain of the bodyguard, enters the city. He burns the house of the Lord, the king's house, and every great house in Jerusalem. The army breaks down the walls all around the city. Then the Chaldeans go to work on the bronze. The pillars, the stands, and the sea are broken into pieces and carried off as raw metal. Jachin and Boaz, standing at that door for close to 4 centuries, are cut up and shipped to Babylon as scrap. The bronze was beyond weight, says the record, as if nobody even attempted a total. And the ark is never mentioned again, not captured, not hidden, not destroyed. It simply stops appearing, and nobody explains why. Jeremiah, oddly, treats this as fine. A day is coming, he says, when nobody will say the words, Ark of the Covenant, anymore, or remember it at all. They will not make another one. The most sacred object in Israel is written off in a single verse, and the book simply carries on to the next thing. 50 years pass. Then Cyrus of Persia takes Babylon and issues a decree that reads less like a prophecy and more like a building permit. Let the house be rebuilt on its old foundations. Let the cost be paid out of the royal treasury. Let the stolen gold and silver vessels be returned. Exiles come back. The foundation is laid. Priests with trumpets, Levites with cymbals, and a crowd shouting so loudly the sound carries for miles. And in the middle of that celebration there is a noise nobody planned for. The old men are crying, and not quietly. The ones old enough to have seen the first house standing are weeping out loud. They can see the old footprint, and what is going up on it, and they can measure the difference. Ezra says the shouting and the weeping mixed until nobody could tell them apart, and the sound was heard far away. That is the honest emotional register of the Second Temple. Real, legitimate, sanctioned by decree and by prophet, and visibly, unmistakably a lesser thing. Haggai addresses it head-on. Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look now? Is it not as nothing? Then he promises that the latter glory of this house will be greater than the former. The work stalls for years and restarts under Haggai and Zechariah. It is finished in the 6th year of Darius the king, somewhere around 516 BC, roughly 70 years after the first house burned, which is what Jeremiah had said. But the inner room is different now. The cherubim are gone. The ark is gone. The chamber behind the curtain is simply empty. Later Jewish sources say a section of the floor was raised slightly to mark where the ark had once stood. A stone outline of an absence behind the curtain. This second temple stands nearly 600 years and has a rough time of it. Antiochus IV, a Greek king, bans the Jewish law and sets an altar to Zeus inside. It is cleansed and rededicated 3 years later, the event Hanukkah remembers. Then Rome. Pompey besieges Jerusalem and the city falls. And he does the unthinkable. He walks straight into the inner room to see what is being kept in there. Tacitus reports the result with a Roman shrug. The place stood empty, he writes, with no image of any god inside. The shrine had nothing to reveal. He meant it as an insult. It is also, entirely by accident, the most theologically accurate sentence any Roman ever wrote. And then Herod, not a Jew by descent and not loved, badly in need of a monument to settle the argument about whether he belonged. Around 20 BC, he begins the largest building project in the region's history. And he does not start with the temple. He starts with the ground underneath it. The natural hilltop is too small, so he encases it in enormous retaining walls. The platform roughly doubles from about 17 acres to 36, and it is still there. You can walk across it today because a platform is very hard to demolish. The retaining wall on its western side is the wall people press their prayers into now. Herod's foundation, not Solomon's temple. That is the whole of the confusion. Its largest surviving block is over 13 meters long and weighs somewhere near 250 tons. Nobody is entirely sure how it was moved. The sanctuary building itself, Josephus says, took about a year and a half. The porticos and outer walls took 8 more years, and the work carried on for decades, which is why, when Jesus is challenged in those courts, the crowd throws a number at him. 46 years to build this temple, and it was not finished yet. Josephus describes the result. Plated with gold that threw the sunrise back so violently you had to look away, and elsewhere so white it looked like a snow-covered mountain. Herod also fenced the inner courts with a low barrier and mounted warning signs along it. One of those signs was dug out of the ground in 1871. It is in Greek, and it is still perfectly readable. No foreigner may pass the barrier. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for the death that follows. That stone sits in a museum in Istanbul, and it is what Paul is reaching for when he writes that Christ has broken down the dividing wall of hostility. Jesus spends a great deal of time in this building, and his relationship with it is not simple. He drives out the sellers and overturns the money changers' tables. He will not let anyone carry goods through the courts as a shortcut. "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations," he says. "You have made it a den of robbers." The first half of that is Isaiah. The second half is lifted straight out of Jeremiah's sermon in the temple gate, the one that ended with Shiloh. Challenged for a sign, he says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." John tells us what he meant. He was speaking about the temple of his body. Then, walking out one day, a disciple plays tourist. "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones." The reply is flat. "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another that will not be thrown down." In the year 70, a Roman army under Titus takes the city after a long siege, and the temple burns. Josephus, who was there, insists it was an accident. He says Titus wanted it saved, and a soldier threw fire into a side chamber against orders. Most historians since have found that account far too convenient. Either way, the outcome is not in dispute. The sacrifices stopped and have never restarted. An entire priesthood lost its function overnight. What is left is the platform, the retaining walls, and eventually a golden dome raised over the bare rock by an Umayyad caliph 6 centuries later. 2,000 years on, nothing of the sanctuary survives at all. It is one of the most literally fulfilled sentences in the whole Bible. There is one more temple, and it is the strangest because it was never built. 14 years after the city fell, Ezekiel is carried in vision to a high mountain. On it is a structure like a city. A man whose appearance is like bronze stands in the gateway holding a linen cord and a measuring reed. And for 3 solid chapters he measures. Gates, chambers, thresholds, walls, courts, steps, all recorded to the cubit in the tone of a surveyor filing a report. His reed is 6 long cubits, each a cubit and a handbreadth, so even the ruler is not the ordinary one. The plan is precise and was never built. 2 things in it are unlike anything in Solomon's. First, the glory of God comes back in by the east gate, the same direction it left by in the same book. Second, and stranger, is the water. A stream comes from under the threshold of the building and runs east. The guide measures 1,000 cubits and walks him through. Ankle deep, another 1,000, knee deep, another, waist deep. One more, and it cannot be crossed at all. A river deep enough to swim in out of a doorway. And the last line of the book is the name of the city that grows around it. The Lord is there. That is the point of the entire vision. Not architecture. Presence, back where it had been, and permanent. Which brings us to the move the New Testament makes with this word, and it is genuinely radical. Paul writes to a fractious congregation in Corinth, "Do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" The "you" there is plural. He is not calling each Christian a temple. He is calling the assembled group one building. 3 chapters later, he applies it individually. So both readings sit in the same letter. Ephesians pushes it further. Apostles and prophets are the foundation. Christ is the cornerstone, and the structure is still growing. Peter uses the same picture and calls the people themselves living stones, built into a spiritual house. Stephen, on trial, makes the sharpest version, and it kills him. Solomon built him a house, he says. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands, which was not, in fact, a new idea at all. It is Solomon's own line from the dedication, quoted back at the building, the better part of 1,000 years later. And the last word is in Revelation. John describes the finished city and notices something missing. I saw no temple in the city, he writes, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb. The story that began with a tent and got a building ends by removing the building altogether. So, back to the wall and the folded paper in the cracks. People press prayers into a retaining wall put up by a client king of Rome to hold a platform level. The building it supported is gone. The room it protected sits under a dome belonging to somebody else. And by the argument the temple made on its opening day, none of that is a defeat. Heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, Solomon said. How much less this house that I have built? He knew. On day one, in front of everybody, the man who built the thing told them precisely what it was not.